Hey Ecofictologists, welcome back to the channel. My name is Lovis and today I am welcoming back Mary Woodbury. I'm sure you're all as excited as I am to see her. Hi Mary.
Hi.
I invited Mary back to talk about something that she mentioned last time when I interviewed her, and that is the concept of ecological weird. So at the moment on the channel, I'm focusing on eco-fantasy in all its glorious forms, and ecological weird is one of those things that I don't know exactly where to place. And so I was researching it and I came across so many articles and they all seem to be written by Mary. So I just thought instead of paraphrasing what she says, I could just invite her on here and she can tell you herself. So for those viewers who are here for the first time or who happen not to know about you and Dragonfly Eco, why don't you give a brief introduction to yourself?
Sure. I run dragonfly.eco, which has been around for over 8 years now. It's an exploration of world ecofiction. Ecofiction is much what it sounds like. It's fiction that's ecologically oriented or aware, uh, has nature, biology as a very strong part of it, whether it's advocacy or just great storytelling, which is what we prefer.
Um, okay, well, this episode about ecological weird is really what I want from it is to really learn from you about what the genre is, the category, whatever you want to call it. So we can just kind of dive right into it. So, Mary, what is ecological weird? Go.
Well, okay, so similar to ecofiction, eco weird fiction is weird fiction with ecological stuff happening in a big way, not just in the background, but up front. And when you do search on it, yeah, my name comes up a lot, but I've also discovered some great articles by the New York Times, by LA Review of Books, and LitHub that go into this a little bit more, especially when they're talking about novels or stories that appear in this fiction. And so even though I don't really consider myself an expert, I have found that there's a lot more questions than answers. The ecological uncanny is another term that's been listed in research papers. Um, so yeah, I mean, if you think about weird fiction, we look at stories that are uncanny, absurd, surreal, and dreamlike. And one thing I thought of with the word absurd is that its Latin roots describe it as being out of tune. So that's what I think now of weird fiction is that um, it's familiar, but it's just off. And it's not really off because of magic or anything like that. It's just off because the writer is writing it that way. So it's kind of on the edge. It's maybe something slipped away from reality. Weird fiction in the past has been supernatural or preternatural, but by supernatural, from what I understand, it's just the unknown. It doesn't necessarily mean ghosts and gothic things. So in LitHub, Elvia Wilk, who's the author of Oval, says the weird is an element of or zone or experience that is not completely explainable according to our current structures for categorizing the world. And yet it exists. We can come into contact with it, experience it, and try to describe it, knowing description will fall short. So she says weird knowledge does not deny the capacity of the human mind and body to produce knowledge, but it does not reduce the world to human subject experience either. Unlike science fiction, in which there is a rational explanation for everything, and fantasy, where magic explains it all, weirdness hovers between poles of explainability.
Oh,
Um,
I like that.
yeah, so
I like that
I,
a lot.
I know. I mean, I think in weird fiction and ecological thought, there's a lot of otherness. There's a lot of maybe just us trying to figure out our changing world. Um, and I mentioned earlier the Anthropocene. If we think of it in the context of the Anthropocene, there's a lot of stuff going on there that Timothy Morton has talked about, including hyperobject, dark ecology, um, the age of symmetry, where we don't really understand everything that's going on. I mean, there's so much academic thought behind this that I can't go into because it's just so complex. But I think there's a lot of ideas behind ecological weird fiction that people can definitely uh, research and kind of go down that rabbit hole.
Okay, well, that actually leads me quite nicely into my next question because you mentioned that ecological weird sits kind of between sci-fi and fantasy. It's not magic, but it's also not really logical. So, would you still say that ecological weird is a type of eco-fantasy, or do you think it's a separate thing? And I know you don't really like categorization that much. Um,
Right.
you're very conscious of othering anything, and
Mhm.
I completely respect that. But
Yeah.
if there were something that I could like look at a book and think, could this be ecological weird? What are those things that
Yeah.
would give it a feeling of ecological weird?
Yeah. I think with ecofiction itself, I'm is so inclusive with other categories of fiction because they all fit together. But with ecological weird or with weird fiction on its own, I think it is different than science fiction and fantasy. Science fiction and fantasy, what's going on, whether it's magic or just, experimental science that's based on reality but is kind of out there. Um, so, what fantasy and weird might have in common between them is the lack of plausibility in a story. But outside of that, fantasy often deals with magic or myth, whereas the weird is not so clear. Um, and it deals a lot with transformation, weird transmutation of things, which is where sometimes the ecological uncanny comes into play. A couple examples of this are in Jeff Vandermeer's Southern X trilogy. In Annihilation, there was a dolphin and it had a human eye. So I just think that's maybe some biological transformation or evolution of this natural area of Area X. And then
Mhm.
another one is that in Rory Power's Wilder Girls,
Oh, I'm
people,
halfway through it and I'm completely hooked. It's so
yeah, it's
creepy, it's
awesome.
wonderful. It's
Yeah. But there's some weird things going on, like the
yes.
people they have this thing called the tox, which is a
Mhm.
disease, and their bodies actually take on it. It depends on whether they're male or female or just whatever, but they take on either animal or plant characteristics, sometimes both. And there's Rory. I've noticed that she nods a little bit to climate change in
Mhm.
her novel, so it's just a really unique way of addressing that, I think.
Those kind of examples, those are both earthbound. Do you think ecological weird has to be earthbound because it's kind of our ecology gone weird, or do you
Um,
think it could be like just an alien race in like a sci-fi fantasy book?
um, I think it could be an alien race, because a lot of science fiction and fantasy does symbolize stuff that's going on in our world. It just kind of pads it in the background to make us, like we recognize it, but we're not looking directly at it, which
Hmm.
I think weird fiction does that too. Um, it's making us kind of look at our realities in a different perspective. Uh, there's Brad Tabas actually wrote a really good paper. Ecological fiction takes our gaze above, kind of, we're looking at reality in a little bit different way, but it also brings it more into focus in a weird way. But I think most of the weird fiction I've read is kind of based on the ecology of our own world, but
Mhm.
not all. I mean, I think there's more science fiction-y kind of stuff sometimes happening.
Mhm.
And there's some wonderful older classic uh, examples of weird fiction that are really ecologically based. Like the Willows, for instance, is this older classic story of these two men who are canoeing somewhere in Europe, and they come across this island where these willow trees are just, and all the biology on the island is just acting very strange. And you know, that's a really favorite story of mine. And then Michael Bernanos is on the other side of the mountain. He did some wonderful uh, story tropes, I think, that I've actually seen later, maybe in a little bit of Jeff Vandermeer's stories and also Rory Powers, where trees will be genuflecting, but it looks like they're praying, or people have turned into I don't know, they get petrified and they're just like statues and
But are there other examples that are kind of more like in the last 20 years have been published?
oh yeah, there's a lot. If you look at my website and just search for weird fiction, you'll find quite a few. Um, as far as novels and everything, there's we mentioned Jeff Vandermeer's The Southern Reach trilogy, Rory Powers' Wilder Girls. One that I just recently read was Christiane's Vadnais's Fauna, which is
Oh.
absolutely crazy and beautiful. Um, there's Karen Tidbach, Caitlin Kiernan are both short story writers for the most part, and you can find some of their stories in other anthologies. And I think that they're both very strong on landscape, the physical landscape around them kind of being a big part of the story. A novel is Samanta Schweblin's Fever Dream, which is just this weird long dialogue that is really interesting and is based on sickness that's caused by a contaminated stream. And I think that it's probably based on reality of where she lives in South America. China Meevil, his Three Moments of an Explosion is an excellent anthology of his own work. So those are just a few. I'm sure there's just tons more recommendations out there. Probably find more on my website if you search.
Definitely. Well, I will definitely link the website in the description and people can have a whale of a time looking for ecological weird on there. Um,
Yeah.
do you want to talk a little bit about your novella that you published in November, Bird Song, under your pen name, Clara Hume? And you said you were inspired by some of this ecological weird to put that in your novel. You don't have to give anything away, but what kind of
Yeah.
aspects in your novel make it ecological weird?
Uh, well, first of all, I consider this novella more genre blurring than just a weird. Um, it also does include some folklore and myths, such as it's kind of brings in the Greek sirens um, but writing it was mostly an experiment for me. It's There's something strange happening to Felsie, who's a young woman who's from Chicago, and she wakes up on this mysterious island where she meets the Greek sirens. Um, Part of that myth plays out, but the bigger part of the story is the island's flora and fauna, which is really unusual. So that's one aspect, kind of a trope that happens with ecological weird fiction. Um, and I've read some more classic weird fiction that includes either a charnel ground or a charnel house, which is a concept that makes sense in some different cultures, but in my story is tied with horror and weird events happening. But these in my story, they also symbolize a natural way of celebrating death and the cycle of life, but they're also from a horror perspective, so it's not exactly as, I don't know, wholesome as we want to think it is. Um, and I talked briefly about the genuflecting trees. I've noticed this in Rory Power's Wilder Girls, as well as Michael Bernanos's The Other Side of the Mountain. I gave a little bit of nod to that in my story. So there is some weird nature happening. It is like weird fiction. You don't explain it. Where, in science fiction, we kind of know maybe the technology explains the difference in the worlds. Or in fantasy, magic usually would explain the difference or explain what's happening. But in my story, it doesn't seem plausible, but also things are not really explained, which is another concept or aspect, I guess, of weird fiction. But the reality of the weird island and Thelsi's modern world, which she kind of goes back to in flashbacks, is just an allegory for how climate change had its roots long ago and is now upon us more than ever now. So, in a nutshell, that's what's going on.
I like
In
it.
bird form.
Yeah, I'm also partway through that book, so I'm looking forward to all of these things. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining me, Mary, and
Thank you.
thanks for talking to us about ecological weird.
All right. Thank you for having me on again. I enjoyed it.
All right, well, I will see you next week, ecofictologists.